Number 1.
100 years ago, Hollywood was stunned by the murder of Irish film director William Desmond Taylor. A century later, the killing of the Carlow man remains a mystery. Born William Cunningham Dean Tanner at Evington House in Carlow on April 26, 1872, he would later change his name to William Desmond Taylor when he ventured to the U.S. Taylor was the son of a British Army officer and grew up in well-to-do surroundings of an Anglo-Irish life. In 1885 he attended Marlborough College in England, but his adventurous spirit saw him take off the America in 1891. Taylor was a keen horseman, and he easily found employment on a cowboy ranch in Kansas, run by Antrim man Francis Turnley. When the ranch closed with the death of Turnley, Taylor went working odd jobs from Missouri to Illinois. He joined a touring theater company, and thus began his career in the world of entertainment. When his sister died back in Ireland, Taylor received a small inheritance, and with this he set himself up in New York. There he met actress Ethel May Hamilton, and they married in 1901. And had one daughter. Taylor and his wife led a charmed life in the Big Apple. The couple were well known in social circles, but the Carlow man had a drinking problem and suffered from depression. In 1908, Taylor suddenly left his family and for a number of years traveled around the States and Canada with many people, including his wife, not knowing his whereabouts. In 1912, Taylor was finally tracked down in San Francisco, and his wife was able to obtain a divorce from him. From San Francisco, Taylor made his way down the Californian coast to a little burgeoning place in Los Angeles called Hollywood. Taylor acted in a number of silent movies before going behind the camera from 1914 onwards. He would quickly become a much sought-after filmmaker in Hollywood, and went on to make up to 60 films. His directorial debut was The Judge's Wife, and he followed that with a very popular 30-episode serial called The Diamond from the Sky. Other notable films of Taylor's include Davy Crockett, Huckleberry Finn and Anne of Green Gables. In 1918, Taylor put his film-making career on hold when he enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force and was stationed in Dunkirk during the dying days of World War I. By 1919 he had reached the rank of major and had served at Berg's, France. After the war, Taylor returned to Hollywood and picked up where he left off, making more hit films, which starred the big names of the day, such as Wallace Reid and Mary Pickford. Taylor would enjoy another few years of screen success before he entered his own final act. On the morning of February 2, 1922, the body of the Carlow man was found inside his bungalow at Alvarado Court, in the affluent neighborhood of Westlake, LA. Taylor, 49, was discovered lying on his living room floor with a bullet in his back. The crime scene was hampered by the number of people milling about the house. When police arrived, there were already dozens of studio executives and actors inside the house. Some were even rummaging through the dead man's belongings. A number of suspects soon emerged, such as 19-year-old actress Mary Miles Minter. She had appeared in a number of Taylor's films and became romantically linked with him, even though her mother had disapproved of the relationship. Rumors circulated that Miss Minter's mother had shot Taylor. She owned a .38 caliber pistol, and following Taylor's death, she got rid of the gun. Another suspect was actress Mabel Normand. She was a comedic actress who starred in Charlie Chaplin films, but she had a terrible drug dependency. Taylor and Normand were close. Some speculated a romantic link, and he sought to cure her drug addiction by giving the police the names of her drug suppliers. Some in Hollywood believed that Normand, or even her drug dealers, had killed Taylor with a hit man. Another suspect was 27-year-old Edward Sands. He was a shady character who had been employed by Taylor as his assistant. Sands was a deserter from the U.S. Army and had a string of convictions for forgery and embezzlement. Months before his murder, Taylor returned home from a vacation to find Sands had stolen his car, along with cash and jewelry. Sands was never heard from again after Taylor's death, which led many speculate that he had a role in the murder of the director. Henry Peavy was another suspect in the murder of Taylor. He worked as the director's butler and driver, and was the person who found his body on that February morning in 1922. Taylor had hired Peavy after Sands, but, just like Sands, Peavy was also a dubious character. After the murder, he was questioned many times by the police, and at one point he was taken to the cemetery where Taylor was interred to scare a confession out of him. but it did not work. Peavy was released without charge. The funeral of William Taylor Desmond took place in St. Paul's Cathedral in L.A. before he was interred in Hollywood Forever Cemetery. His last film, The Top of New York, was released 4 months after his death. The murder of the Carlo man has never been solved, but he has not been forgotten in his native county, where a William Taylor Desmond Society oversee an annual film festival in his honor.
Number 2.
The disappearances of 8 women whose bodies have never been found may never be solved after police missed crucial opportunities to investigate their murders, a new audiobook has claimed. Having grown up in rural Northern Ireland in the 1990s, crime writer Claire McGowan was shocked to discover that during her teen years, 8 women had vanished without a trace just hours away from her small town in County Down. The string of disappearances in the eastern part of Ireland would later be dubbed the Vanishing Triangle, and in her latest audiobook, the author explores why these cases remain unsolved and highlights a series of other murders she believes could be linked to the 8 missing people. She believes a culture of secrecy and victim blaming all had a role to play during the initial investigations, with retired officers admitting to her there was a certain amount of judgment about the sexual behavior of the women who disappeared. Speaking to Femail, Claire speculated that while it's likely a serial killer was responsible in these cases, prime suspects within the women's own lives could also have been involved in some cases. She said, "In some cases there is an obvious suspect. 3 of the cases there was a man in their life who became a suspect. Nothing was ever proved. What I've tried to do in the book is say when you look into it, probably not all of those women were killed by the same person. But that's also an interesting story. Why, if there is an obvious suspect and a history of domestic violence, why was that person never charged? Why would the police then be like, oh, she's just disappeared, rather than her violent ex-partner possibly killed her?" The first of the disappearances was Annie McCarrick, 26, from New York, who was last seen taking a bus to Enniscorthy on March 26, 1993. After telling a friend she planned to go to the Wicklow Mountains for the day. The same year, Eva Brennan vanished shortly after a family lunch in Terranor, Dublin, followed by student Imelda Keenan, who was last seen in Waterford City in 1994. In November 1995, 21-year-old Jojo Dullard disappeared while hitching home at night in Company Kildare, while Fiona Pender was last seen leaving home by her boyfriend in 1996. While 7 months pregnant. 2 years later, Fiona Sinnott vanished in Rossler after leaving a pub with accompanied by ex-partner Sean Carroll, the father of her daughter, while Ciara Breen disappeared later that year in Dundalk. Deidre Jacob vanished in 1998 and was spotted by multiple witnesses within just yards of her parents' house before disappearing in Kildare. The crime writer stressed that it's impossible to know for sure whether these women have been murdered, because none of their bodies have ever been found. Despite all disappearing in such a short space of time, Claire only discovered the cases while researching for a new crime fiction book 10 years ago. "I think partly the news was really dominated by the Troubles," she said. "Growing up in the 90s, I think a lot of what you might call ordinary murders, non-political murders, we didn't hear about them. I think that kind of fed into a perception that they didn't really happen in Ireland. It was a safe place to be as a woman, if you were lucky enough not to get caught in the Troubles. I don't think that was true based on what I've learned from my research." She said that one of the women, 17-year-old Ciara Breen, would cross the Irish border and go to the same discos as she did as a teen, but that she never heard of the case, despite it taking place 20 miles from her own home. "Because it was across the border, I don't think I ever heard about it," said Claire. "But she went to the same discos as I went to, because it's really easy to cross the border. There was no border at that point. I found that quite shocking that nobody ever said, this is happening." Claire explained she felt safe growing up in Northern Ireland, but admitted that there was still a lot of oppression and shame about sex, with harassment such as groping not taken seriously at all. She said, "It was a dangerous place to live because you could get shot at any moment, and we definitely felt that as kids. There were always soldiers around with guns. We just didn't feel anything sexual could happen to us as such." She went on, "We did live with a lot of things that seemed normal at the time that don't now. Groping was incredibly common. I think if I used to go to teenage discos and you would get groped at least 10 times in one night, that was seen as quite normal. Most people just put up with it. It was seen as so completely normal. There was definitely very little discussion around sex or consent or anything like that. There was still a lot of oppression, a lot of shame. She said that while writing the book. The first question people asked was whether the women involved were sex workers, assuming that might have been an explanation for why it went under the radar. I think partly we've grown to assume there's a level of risk in doing that kind of work, said Claire. Maybe it's out of fear. A certain type of woman puts herself in danger. Maybe we don't like to think this could happen to anyone. You could be taken off the street in the middle of the day. The thing we tell ourselves, oh, that could never happen to me because of XYZ. And it is sadly true. A lot of sex workers are killed, and there is little done about those cases. That is also true in itself. Claire said that officers made assumptions about the women's sexual behavior in their initial inquiries, often guessing the women had gone off with boyfriends after they were reported missing. There was definitely judgment, and a few of the retired officers I spoke to did explicitly say that to me. There was a certain amount of judgment made about, she's that kind of girl. She's that kind of woman, along with assumptions about sexual behavior. Claire said a culture of secrecy and silence was commonplace in Ireland in the 1990s. She explained that fostering an atmosphere where people felt they could say things to the police would have helped massively in the cases. She continued, I think this was another huge problem in Ireland. People just didn't trust the police and didn't want to tell them things, and in some of the cases there were witnesses, not who had seen anything happening, who had heard things that could be connected, and they didn't come forward for sometimes years. She also believes separate police forces may also have had an impact on the original investigation. They had two different police forces in the same country, and they sort of behave a bit as if the border is this uncrossable frontier. Which it absolutely is not, she said. It wasn't even then. You could drive across the border without anyone stopping you at all. Elsewhere in the book, the author explores a series of murders and disappearances of women in Ireland in the years leading up to 1993. She said, 8 women went missing in the area around Dublin within about 5 years. None of them have ever been found. Even before that, there were quite a few murders of women in the same area where they did find the bodies, but they haven't always been able to solve the cases. It's possible some of those are connected, because the areas sometimes are so close to each other. We're talking about the same little towns and villages, and because they were buried in the mountains, it's probably that's the same thing that happened to some of these women. Because they were unsolved, it seems implausible there were so many different murderers operating in this area. She says there were a lot of parallels between the cases, admitting it's difficult to know why police never connected the disappearances. You'd think it would be obvious to think maybe some of these are connected when there are so many disappearances. We're talking about Dublin, which is a biggish city. But in the 90s the whole population of Ireland was only 3.5 million. It's a small country, so those are a lot of disappearances. I think one big reason was the Irish police just weren't used to working with this kind of crime. Sexually motivated. So just really didn't think to consider that might have happened. So it took a very long time to get to that point to think they were connected, even when some of the families were saying they could be. She said family members had questioned police about links between Annie McCarrick and Eva Brennan, who disappeared nearby each other in the same year. They were told don't be ridiculouses. They weren't willing to consider it, said Claire. They were looking for other reasons, like maybe a woman had gone off with a boyfriend, maybe she killed herself. I think once people got to the point of thinking, oh, she probably was abducted, they were looking for reasons like, did she talk to someone in a pub? Did she go off with someone willingly? Did she get into a car? Why was she walking home? The author believes that there's still a chance of finding out what happened to the women, but that there are several ways to improve the way in which missing cases are investigated. Listening to the families and not making an assumption about what might have happened, she said. Not victim blaming. Listening to what people's family and friends have to say about them. Speaking of the unsolved cases, she added, I think the only thing that could happen would be either some bodies could be found, and they have to be somewhere, so that can always happen, or somebody would come forward and talk. The conclusion I come to is there probably was an unidentified serial murderer But in some cases the story is much closer to home, and just really sad everyday kind of story.
Number 3.
Every so often we come across stories that leave us with an eerie feeling of incompleteness. It seems as if our brains put us on notice, forcing us to fill in the missing gaps until we get satisfaction. And the Peter Bergmann case is one of those mysteries that has kept the police, journalists, and internet sleuths on tenterhooks for the past 11 years. The story unfolds on a quiet beach in Ireland, where a local man, Arthur Kinsella, discovers a human body on the beach. On first glance, it appeared as if the man had gone for a swim, drowned, and subsequently washed ashore during low tide. Bergmann was found naked, his clothes scattered along the shore. But here was when things got strange. There was no documentation of any kind found inside his clothes confirming his identity. Stranger still, all the tags from his clothes, including his undergarments, had been carefully cut away with scissors. The police also could not find Peter Bergmann in the lists of people who arrived in the UK legally. And the address that Bergmann had left while checking in a local hotel turned out to be a fake. In the following days, many more peculiar things emerged about this dead man. Chiefly that he had purposely concealed his true identity. He had given his name as Peter Bergmann when checking into the Sligo City Hotel on June 12, speaking with what staff later recalled as either a German or Austrian accent. The Austrian address he gave turned out to be false. It did not exist. When CCTV footage from the hotel was later reviewed by the police, they discovered Peter Bergmann had left the hotel 13 times with a full purple plastic bag. Each time he returned, he was carrying nothing. It was evident he had disposed of the contents of these bags somewhere around the town, but nothing was captured on camera. In time, it was established this man had traveled to Sligo town by bus from Derry. Where or how he entered Ireland prior to his arrival in the north was never discovered. After arriving in Sligo, he engaged in many mysterious activities. Mysterious because they were tantalizing leads that ultimately led nowhere, except to indicate that this man had come to Sligo with the specific purpose of vanishing. There were the 10 stamps he bought at the local post office for letters or a package he was not seen posting. There was a reconnaissance trip by taxi to Ross's Point Beach 2 days before he was found dead there. Although he was captured on CCTV on arrival in Sligo with 2 bags, neither of them, nor their contents, were ever found after his death. The mysteries added up. It was originally assumed he died from drowning, but an autopsy revealed both a terminal illness and that he had had a heart attack on the beach. How could someone simultaneously plan to eradicate all traces of their identity, while also dying in what seemed to be an unplanned way? For months after his death, the man remained in a Sligo morgue, while Gardaí waited for family or friends to come forward to claim his body. Pictures of him as captured on CCTV were circulated throughout Europe and beyond. Nothing happened. In September of 2009, this unknown man was eventually interred in Sligo Cemetery in a plot purchased by the health service executive. His grave is still unmarked. 2 years ago, I wrote The Unsolved Mystery of Peter Bergmann for the Irish Times. I also made a 3-part Irish Times narrative podcast on the story called Atlantic. It involved interviews with many people who had had some tangential contact with this mysterious man. The detectives who worked on the case, the taxi driver who brought him to Ross's Point, the people who saw him on the beach, the man who discovered his body, the doctor who did the autopsy, and the man who buried him. After the story and podcast series went live, I waited in hope for some lead to emerge that would help the Sligo detectives solve the case. It seemed absolutely astonishing to me that someone could vanish so completely in 2009. As someone who had a face that was clearly visible in the CCTV footage. Had nobody missed this distinctive tall, thin man in his 60s, who wore glasses, had a terminal illness, and who came to Ireland from some other country, apparently to deliberately vanish? In the intervening 2 years, I have received countless emails from people all over the world who read the story and listened to the podcast, and who had ideas and theories as to who Peter Bergmann might really be. No detail was too small to be ignored, including the possible origin of the hotel soap found in one of his pockets. The email I received the most frequently, and still do, is about DNA. Was it not possible to find out who he was via a DNA test? I regretted not including in my story the fact that I had already put this same obvious question back in 2019 to the Sligo detectives. They had replied, "We don't send DNA to Ancestry or other sites. While it might advance an area where Peter might have come from, it doesn't advance his identification. The Sligo detectives do retain his DNA, so if that policy ever changes, more information may emerge that way." An Austrian newspaper, and then a German one, got in contact and subsequently carried extensive stories of their own, with appeals for information. None was forthcoming. Someone in Germany with a degree in forensic art and facial identification sent images he had created, with the hope this might jog memories. It didn't. A famous forensic genealogist in California, who works with police agencies internationally to solve the identities of unknown dead people, got in touch. Nothing has come of that so far. The fact is, 12 years after the discovery of his body on a beach at Ross's Point on June 16th, we still do not know who the man calling himself Peter Bergmann was, or where he came from. But someone out there must know who he is. Someone always knows something.
Number 4.
It has been 52 years since Aer Lingus Flight 712 crashed into the sea near Tusker Rock off the coast of County Wexford, killing all 61 passengers and crew. However, the truth of what happened that day is still unknown. The flight and resulting accident occurred on Sunday, March 24, 1968. The aircraft involved was a Vickers Viscount registration number EIM called the St. Phelim. To set the scene and the lead up to it, Aer Lingus Flight number 712 was a routine hop across the Irish Sea from Cork Airport, Cork to London Heathrow, LHR. Unlike the winter weather Ireland has today, 52 years ago, winters were much harsher, and in the early months of 1968, there had been repeated snowfalls. In 1968, Ireland was the winter home to thousands of swans who, in the spring, fly home to their breeding grounds in Iceland and Russia. Finally, by March, spring was arriving, and it was time for the swans to leave. This led to much speculation that Aer Lingus Flight 712 had suffered a bird strike, and as a result of it crashed into the sea. The investigation into the crash reported that swans might have played a part. While a bird strike is possible, many theories surround what really happened, including the aircraft being shot down by a British missile. Perfectly positioned along the Viscount's flight path was the Royal Air Force, RAF Station Aberporth. At the time, it was the United Kingdom's leading missile testing range, where missiles were frequently fired at unmanned drones flying over the Irish Sea. The British Ministry of Defence immediately said they were not involved and had nothing to do with the plane crash. Another theory is that a British warship conducting exercises in the area, HMS Penelope, mistook the aircraft for a target drone and shot it down. The Ministry of Defence claims that there were no ships in the vicinity, but cannot explain why HMS Penelope's logbook went missing. One theory we can rule out is that weather may have played a part, as it was a beautifully sunny day when the Viscount took off at 10:32 in the morning. Everything was proceeding as usual until the 22-year-old co-pilot Paul Heffernan is allegedly heard saying the following, according to the Irish Times: 12,000 feet descending, spinning rapidly. That was the last communication heard from the plane, and had London Air Traffic Control, ATC, immediately informing their Shannon counterparts. Aer Lingus Flight EI 362, en route from Dublin to Bristol, was asked to descend to 500 feet and search for the missing plane. Unable to spot anything, a full alert was declared at 11:25, with a report of wreckage cited just over an hour later. Despite the wreckage's sighting, search planes failed to find anything and called off the search until the following day. Eventually, the aircraft's remains were found and bodies recovered 6 miles (11 kilometers) northeast of Tusker Rock, meaning large rock in Old Norse. It is a group of rocks that are responsible for more shipwrecks than any other place in Ireland. At the time, the Irish government said it was happy how the search went, but a later report in 2000 noted that the state did not have enough resources to search sufficiently, saying, "The lack of a financial commitment to indefinitely fund the search and salvage operation may have contributed to its limited success." Looking at it now from 52 years on, it's hard to imagine that more effort to recover the bodies and discover what had caused the crash seems unthinkable. When speaking about the crash with the Irish Examiner newspaper in 2018, one of the victims' relatives, Selin O'Donoghue, said that questioning the authorities was not a part of the culture. Not in the Ireland of 1968. We were still nearly fairy and leprechaun country at that point. People were lucky to have landline phones. Computers hadn't even started, she said. Anything was possible in those days because nobody had any way of knowing otherwise. You cannot talk in the language of 2018 for 50 years ago. Ultimately, it took the relatives of the only American victims of the crash, Joseph and Mary Gangelhoff, to say that they did not accept the initial investigation report. What seemed strange to them was that the British military took charge of the rescue and salvage operation, and that there was no civilian body to provide an independent investigation. The Air Accident Investigation Unit of today was only established in 1994. Eventually, after public pressure and media speculation that a missile may have shot the plane down, a new independent study was held in 2000. The study found serious omissions in the aircraft maintenance records, leading to speculation that some kind of structural failure caused the plane to spin out of control. If a missile or drone had not hit the plane, the finger pointed to a problem with the aircraft itself, a problem that might have come to light if the aircraft had been properly maintained. The day I got a call from Department of Public Enterprise in Dublin, and they told me that the service cards relating to the Viscount had disappeared on the day of the crash, and that fact was omitted from the original report. I knew then what the real story was, Selin said. It was an engineering fault, plain as day. So all the talk of it being shot down, of drones, of the British and the military, it was nonsense. It was the best scapegoat they could have thought of at the time, and it kept everyone's attention away from the real issue. Another interesting fact is that most of the plane, including the tailplane, was never recovered. What was recovered ended up being disposed of without giving notice to parties that might have wanted to examine them. Up until 1995, 139 Vickers Viscounts have crashed around the world, with the loss of 1,573 lives. Following the crash of Flight 712, Aer Lingus put its 12 Viscounts up for sale and replaced them with newer Boeing aircraft. Surprisingly, unlike other airlines that discontinue flight numbers following a crash, Aer Lingus still operates Flight 712 from Cork to London Heathrow. Unlike 1968, far fewer swans now migrate as far south for the winter, thanks to climate change, and it would not be acceptable for maintenance logbooks to go missing, as they did for Flight 712 in 1968. While we will still don't know what really happened to Aer Lingus Flight 712, there seems to be a consensus that it was some kind of structural failure.
Number 5.
An Irish-American man who would now be in his 70s is still wanted in the US for murdering his wife almost 50 years ago. In 1967, 27-year-old June Maloney, a resident of Rochester, New York, left her husband Joseph Maloney on less than amicable terms. Ironically, leaving her husband because of his vicious behavior, Joe took his vicious nature one step further and poisoned his estranged wife before fleeing to Ireland. Maloney's friend, Neil Dunkelberg, was an amateur chemist who kept his own lab in his basement. Turning to his friend for help, Maloney inquired about a odorless, tasteless, and untraceable poison, with which, he claimed, he could kill a dog that was going through his garbage. Highly suspicious of Maloney's motives, Dunkelberg refused and warned his family to let no one but himself into the basement laboratory, especially Maloney. A while later, the family went on vacation, leaving only Dunkelberg's sister looking after the house. While Dunkelberg and his family were away, Maloney once again returned to their home in an attempt to acquire the poison. Manipulating Dunkelberg's sister, he succeeded in entering the basement. For the next few weeks, both Joe and his wife June appeared to be on good terms, and June returned to their family home on the day of their son's 5th birthday. It is now believed that while celebrating their son's birthday, Joe slipped poison to June. The following day, June's friend, Wanda Mordenga arrived to June's apartment to find Joe attending to his wife with a doctor. Despite the doctor ruling the illness as a bout of food poisoning, Wanda was also suspicious, and rightly so, as the next day, June slipped into a coma and was hospitalized. Doctors were unable to find a reason for the illness, and Joe stepped in to inform them that June suffered from depression and had attempted suicide. His claim, however, only aroused further suspicion, as doctors knew that a coma is not self-induced, but a naturally occurring bodily function. June never awoke from the coma and died on June 5, 1967. An autopsy found that she had ingested a poison that matched that stolen from Dunkelberg's lab while on vacation. The amount of poison ingested also matched the amount stolen. Just 4 hours after her death, June's husband Joe was arrested for her murder. Following his conviction on first degree and his sentence of life imprisonment in September 1967, Maloney pleaded insanity and was granted permission to be sent to Rochester State Mental Hospital. In a further swoop of foul play, 2 weeks after his admission to Rochester State, Maloney escaped and disappeared. On pleading insanity and asking permission to be sent to the hospital, Maloney had failed to mention that he had once worked there as a janitor and was well in tune with the hospital's layout. 5 years later in Ireland, while Maloney was still counted as a criminal at large in the US, a man named Michael O'Shea called the Gardaí, Irish police, to his Dublin home to investigate a burglary. In order to establish which fingerprints were O'Shea's and which were the burglars', he was required to supply fingerprints. To much surprise, the Irish police discovered that the fingerprints taken belonged to a man sentenced to a life sentence in the US 5 years previous. The fingerprints belonged to Joe Maloney, denying that he was anybody other than O'Shea, and due to the lack of extradition agreement between the US and Ireland at the time, O'Shea could not be arrested on suspicion of being Joe Maloney and went free. Years later in 1984, the Irish Republic established full diplomatic relations with the United States, and O'Shea was arrested still claiming his innocence. The agreement was again made void in 1986, and O'Shea was released to once again disappear. He was never seen again. Today, if still alive, Maloney would be in his 70s, and is still wanted in US to serve his life sentence.